The last traces of daylight fade behind the rolling hills as you continue along a narrow country road, your boots pressing into damp earth that has carried countless travelers before you. Every step reminds you how long the journey has been, yet the crisp autumn air carries the comforting scent of burning firewood somewhere ahead, suggesting that warmth cannot be far away. If you had wandered these roads centuries ago, would you have recognized the signs that told every weary traveler a safe shelter was waiting beyond the next rise? The landscape grows quieter with every passing minute, as though the world itself is preparing for sleep. Bare branches sway gently overhead, while a cool breeze slips beneath your woolen cloak, making you instinctively pull it tighter across your shoulders without breaking your steady pace. There are no voices, no wagons, only the distant call of a bird settling for the night, and the rhythmic sound of your own footsteps echoing across the road. Then, almost without warning, a single amber light appears through the darkness. It glows softly behind a small window, far too steady to belong to a campfire, revealing the presence of a building that has welcomed strangers long before your arrival and will continue to do so long after you are gone. In medieval Europe, a light like this meant far more than comfort. It often meant survival. As you draw closer, the outline of the inn slowly emerges from the fading shadows. Thick timber beams frame pale plaster walls, while a steep, thatched roof shelters generations of stories beneath it, each traveler leaving with memories that quietly blended into the next. Before anyone spoke a single word, the building itself seemed to promise that, for one night at least, the road could finally be forgotten. A wooden sign swings gently above the entrance, moving only enough to catch the glow of the lantern hanging nearby. It bears no written name, only a familiar symbol carved for those who could not read, because in a world where literacy was rare, an image often spoke more clearly than words ever could. What forgotten conversations had begun beneath that same sign, and how many secrets had disappeared into the warmth behind its door? The smell reaches you before the doorway does. Smoke from seasoned firewood mingles with the rich aroma of a simmering meal, creating the unmistakable scent of a place where travelers gather not simply to eat, but to recover from another demanding day on the road. Your exhaustion suddenly feels heavier, as though your body has been waiting for permission to stop. You rest one hand against the rough wooden door before pushing it open. The hinges complain with a familiar groan, and almost instantly a wave of heat rolls toward you, carrying with it flickering firelight, quiet conversation, and the reassuring feeling that, for the first time since morning, you are no longer alone. Without realizing it, you have stepped into one of the most important places in the medieval world, and in where history was lived one ordinary evening at a time. The warmth wraps around you so completely that the chill of the evening seems to disappear in a single breath. A broad stone hearth dominates the far end of the hall, its fire crackling steadily as smoke drifts upward through the dark rafters, leaving the air hazy enough to soften every shadow without hiding a single face. For travelers who spent their days exposed to wind and rain, this was more than comfort. It was proof that they had reached a place where the dangers of the road could pause until morning. A handful of guests glance toward the doorway as you step inside, measuring the newcomer with the practiced caution of people accustomed to strangers. Their attention lingers only for a moment before conversations quietly resume, mugs return to rough wooden tables, and the evening settles back into its familiar rhythm, reminding you that arrivals like yours are simply another part of life here. You quickly understand that in a medieval inn, curiosity rarely lasted longer than the first impression unless someone gave others a reason to remember them. Near the fire, the innkeeper finally approaches with the calm confidence of someone who has repeated the same welcome thousands of times. Flour dust clings to his apron, soot darkens his sleeves, and his weathered hands speak of years spent feeding travelers rather than writing records. Yet there is nothing unfriendly in his direct manner. Before asking your name, he simply asks whether you need a bed for the night, supper, and space for a horse, because on roads like these those questions mattered far more than introductions. You explain that your journey is on foot and that a place to sleep will be enough. A single silver coin disappears into his palm, the exchange requiring no negotiation because custom often carried greater authority than written law, especially in villages far from royal courts. Every experienced traveler understood that generosity toward the innkeeper usually purchased more than a meal. It quietly bought trust, respect, and sometimes the safest corner of the house. Without ceremony, he fills a heavy clay mug from a nearby barrel and places it in your hands. The ale is warmer than any modern drink would be, lightly sweet with grain, and surprisingly refreshing after a full day of walking beneath an open sky, offering not luxury, but reliability in a world where clean water was not always guaranteed. Could something as ordinary as a simple mug of ale have been one of the greatest comforts a medieval traveler could hope to find? As you drink, the innkeeper nods toward a narrow staircase leading to the upper floor. He suggests leaving your belongings beside whichever bed frame remains empty before returning downstairs, explaining that supper will soon be served, and his steady voice carries the reassuring confidence of a man whose entire livelihood depends upon making strangers feel safe for a single night. You thank him with a quiet gesture before climbing the creaking steps, unaware that this ordinary evening still holds stories waiting to unfold. You pause halfway up the staircase and glance back into the common room before disappearing into the upper floor. Firelight dances across worn tables polished smooth by generations of elbows, tankards, and quiet conversations, while the gentle murmur of travelers blends into a sound that feels almost as comforting as the warmth itself. Every inn had its own rhythm, yet evenings like this followed patterns that thousands of weary people would have recognized across medieval Europe. The stairs complain beneath your weight, each step reminding you that this building has endured countless seasons of rain, frost, and wandering strangers. At the top, the roof slopes so low near the walls that anyone of average height must instinctively lower their head, while faint light filters upward through the cracks in the floorboards below, leaving the loft wrapped in a soft amber glow. The room is simple, yet after an endless day on the road, simplicity feels like luxury. Rows of rope-supported bed frames stretch across the chamber, each covered with thick straw mattresses protected by coarse wool blankets that have seen many winters. There are no private rooms waiting behind wooden doors, because most travelers share their sleeping space with complete strangers, trusting necessity more than comfort. Privacy, as you understand it today, was a privilege that very few people expected while traveling through the medieval countryside. Several places have already been claimed by bundles of clothing, leather satchels, and carefully placed belongings resting quietly upon the bedding. One traveler has left a sheathed dagger beside his blanket, not as a threat, but as an unmistakable sign that the space is already spoken for, a silent custom respected by nearly everyone who depended on the goodwill of fellow guests. Even without spoken rules, everyone seems to understand exactly where the invisible boundaries lie. You choose an empty place beside one of the heavy roof beams where the straw appears fresher than elsewhere. Setting your leather bag beneath the folded blanket, you lower yourself onto the edge of the bed and feel the ropes sink gently beneath your weight before pulling back with surprising firmness, creating a mattress that is far more comfortable than its appearance first suggests. Could this modest bed have felt richer to a tired traveler than the finest chamber ever could to someone who had never walked these roads? For a few peaceful moments you remain seated in silence, allowing your aching legs to rest while your breathing slowly returns to normal. The temptation to lie down immediately grows stronger with every passing second, yet another sensation soon demands your attention as the unmistakable smell of supper drifts upward through the wooden floor beneath you. Hunger, after all, often speaks louder than exhaustion. You rise once more and descend the narrow staircase toward the hall below. More lamps have now been lit along the walls, their small flames pushing back the darkness just enough to reveal faces, wooden beams, and rising curls of smoke without disturbing the calm mood that has settled over the room. The evening is changing almost imperceptibly, shifting from arrival to shared meal, and with it comes another opportunity to discover what life inside a medieval inn truly felt like. The aroma becomes richer as you return to the hall, rising from a large iron pot, suspended above glowing embers rather than open flames. Steam curls lazily toward the rafters while the innkeeper and a young woman, likely his daughter, move from guest to guest with the quiet efficiency that comes only from years of repeating the same evening ritual. Nothing feels hurried, yet everything unfolds with practiced precision, as though every movement belongs to an old tradition that no one needs to explain. One by one, the travelers step forward carrying their own wooden spoons and eating knives, tools as essential as a cloak or a pair of sturdy boots. Thick vegetable stew, enriched with beans, onions, and small pieces of smoked pork, is ladled into coarse clay bowls before each guest receives a dense loaf of dark bread whose firm crust serves almost like a second dish. Meals such as these rarely sought to impress, but they were carefully prepared to restore strength after long miles beneath an unforgiving sky. You settle onto a rough bench between two men whose journeys could hardly be more different. One is a cloth merchant returning from the Low Countries, his weathered face marked by weeks of travel, while the other wears the unmistakable shell of a pilgrim stitched to his hat, revealing that his destination lies far to the southwest along one of Europe's most famous sacred roads. Their clothing tells their stories long before either man begins to speak. The merchant quietly explains that swollen rivers forced him away from his usual route after a bridge collapsed during recent storms. The pilgrim smiles wearily as he admits that his knees finally persuaded him to choose the comfort of an inn instead of another monastery dormitory, proving that even the most devoted travelers welcomed an ordinary bed whenever fortune allowed. Their conversation flows as naturally as the passing mugs of ale, carried not by excitement, but by the quiet relief shared among people who have safely completed another day. Nearby sits a third traveler who speaks very little. A leather document case remains strapped firmly across his chest even while he eats, and although nobody asks what message he carries, everyone notices that he never allows it to leave his reach for even a moment. What news could be important enough to follow a man all the way to the supper table without ever leaving his hands? The room never grows loud despite the number of guests gathered inside. Voices remain low, interrupted only by the scrape of wooden spoons against clay bowls, the occasional crackle from the fire, and the dull sound of a mug returning to the tabletop, creating an atmosphere that feels almost peaceful after the uncertainty of the open road. Fatigue softens every conversation, replacing animated debate with measured exchanges that drift gently through the hall. News moves across the tables as steadily as the ale itself. Someone warns that the next stretch of road has become difficult after heavy rain. Another complains about the rising price charged by a blacksmith several villages away, and before long the discussion turns to wolves reportedly seen near a distant woodland, although one merchant dismisses the story with a quiet laugh, insisting they were probably only stray dogs seen from too far away. Even so, nobody seems eager to test that theory after sunset. The innkeeper eventually joins the conversation for a few moments, resting both hands upon the edge of the table while offering another round of ale to anyone who wishes it. As the evening settles deeper into the night, he begins speaking not merely as a host, but as someone preserving memories handed down through generations, explaining that the green branch hanging outside the inn has welcomed travelers since long before his own grandfather first stood behind this hearth. Few symbols on the medieval road carried more meaning than those simple signs, and behind every one of them waited a story that was almost ready to be told. The innkeeper smiles faintly as he traces the carved symbol hanging above the doorway with a glance rather than a gesture. He explains that long before painted names became common, travelers searched for familiar images instead of letters, and a simple evergreen branch could promise warmth, food, and shelter more clearly than any written sign. In a world where many people could not read, these quiet symbols became landmarks remembered across generations. The pilgrim nods in agreement before describing the many houses of rest he has visited during months upon the road. Some displayed the shell of St. James. Others carried the image of a lion, a cross, or an animal tied to an old local legend, each sign allowing exhausted strangers to recognize a welcoming door before darkness completely swallowed the landscape. Every road seemed to have its own language, spoken not with words, but with carved wood and fading paint. The merchant chuckles softly and recalls an inn from his homeland, whose weathered barrel sign could be recognized from nearly half a mile away. He insists that experienced traders often remembered the symbols better than the villages themselves, because after weeks of travel the promise of a dependable meal mattered far more than the name of the settlement surrounding it. Is it surprising that people remembered the places that offered safety more vividly than those they merely passed through? You continue eating while listening to the conversation unfold, scraping the last of the thick stew from your bowl with a piece of coarse bread. The warmth of the fire, the steady voices around you, and the comforting weight of a full stomach slowly dissolve the tension that had settled into your muscles throughout the day, replacing caution with a quiet sense of belonging. For a little while, the road no longer feels endless. One by one, the travelers begin drifting away from the tables. The messenger is the first to rise, securing the leather case against his chest before disappearing toward the staircase without saying more than a brief farewell, while the merchant stretches his aching hands and suppresses a long yawn that draws knowing smiles from those still awake. The day's conversations are ending naturally, giving way to the silence that every weary traveler eventually welcomes. Only the pilgrim remains beside the fire for a few extra moments. His fingers move slowly across a string of worn wooden prayer beads, almost by instinct, while the flames reflect softly in his thoughtful eyes, and no one interrupts him because everyone understands that the final minutes before sleep often belong to quiet reflection rather than conversation. Even inside a crowded inn, there is room for private thoughts. The innkeeper's daughter gathers the empty bowls and mugs with practiced movements before stacking them beside a wooden tub that will serve for a quick washing at dawn. Fresh logs settle onto the glowing embers with a shower of sparks, filling the hall once again with the gentle crackling that has accompanied travelers for centuries, while the old dog beside the hearth lazily lifts its head only long enough to find a warmer place to rest. Nothing remarkable appears to be happening, yet the evening feels strangely unforgettable. As you climb the staircase once more, the common room fades behind you until only muffled voices and the steady breathing of the fire remain. You expect the night to end in peaceful sleep, but somewhere below, after nearly everyone has retired, another voice quietly enters the inn, a voice you have not heard before, and without realizing it, you find yourself listening, wondering what story has just arrived with the darkness. The last embers in the hearth glow softly as the conversations below begin to fade into scattered whispers. One by one, benches empty, mugs are gathered, and the familiar rhythm of the inn slowly gives way to the quieter sounds of a house preparing for the night. It is only now, as silence settles over the room, that you realize how exhausting a full day on medieval roads truly is. You return upstairs carrying nothing but the small lantern handed to you by the innkeeper. Its warm flame throws gentle shadows across the timber walls, revealing roof beams blackened by decades of smoke and weather, while every step across the old wooden floor reminds you that thousands of travelers have walked these same boards before you. Each creak seems to preserve a memory that no written record ever captured. Around you, other guests prepare for sleep without unnecessary conversation. A merchant carefully folds his wool cloak to use as an extra blanket. A pilgrim quietly removes his worn boots before whispering an evening prayer, and an elderly traveler massages stiff hands that have spent another long day gripping the reins of a wagon. No one appears hurried, because tomorrow's journey will begin soon enough. You settle onto your rope bed once again, this time allowing your tired body to sink fully into the straw-filled mattress beneath the coarse linen covering. It is far from luxurious by modern standards, yet compared to sleeping beneath open skies or inside abandoned barns, it feels unexpectedly welcoming. Comfort, you begin to understand, was measured very differently in the Middle Ages. The lantern beside your bed flickers gently as a cool breeze slips through tiny gaps beneath the roof thatch. Outside, the wind carries distant sounds that drift across the sleeping countryside, blending with the occasional stamp of a horse inside the stable below and the quiet rustling of animals settling for the night. Even here, sheltered by thick walls, the outside world never feels completely far away. You close your eyes for only a moment before another sound reaches your ears. Somewhere below, a door opens slowly, followed by calm footsteps crossing the common room long after every guest was expected to be asleep. The movement is unhurried, almost familiar, yet unusual enough to stir your curiosity without disturbing the peaceful atmosphere. Rather than rising to investigate, you simply listen. The footsteps pause beside the hearth. A few quiet words are exchanged with the innkeeper, and then silence returns almost as quickly as it had been broken. Whoever arrived so late clearly belonged to the kind of traveler who preferred discretion over attention, a reminder that not every journey followed the comfort of daylight. Eventually, even those lingering sounds disappear into the stillness of the night. Above you, the ancient roof creaks softly as the timber responds to the cooling air, while the scent of smoke lingering in the room mixes with dry straw and aged oak, creating an aroma that countless generations would have recognized as the smell of temporary refuge. These were the scents of a world where every safe night's rest was earned. Sleep comes gradually rather than all at once. Your thoughts drift from the miles already behind you to the uncertain roads still waiting beyond tomorrow's sunrise. And somewhere between those reflections, you begin to understand why inns became far more than places to eat or sleep. They were crossroads where merchants exchanged news, pilgrims found encouragement, messengers carried kingdoms upon their shoulders, and ordinary travelers briefly shared lives that would never cross again. As the fire downstairs burns lower and darkness quietly fills every corner of the building, another realization settles into your mind. This modest inn, standing beside an unremarkable country road, reflects the daily life of medieval Europe more honestly than the grandest castles or the richest cathedrals ever could. And by morning, when the first light reaches the thatched roof, you will discover that the day inside a medieval inn begins long before the sun appears above the horizon. A faint gray light begins to gather beyond the tiny window long before the sun itself appears above the horizon. The inn remains wrapped in silence, yet the darkness has already started to loosen its grip, revealing the outlines of roof beams that seemed invisible only moments before. Medieval mornings rarely began with the sunrise, they began with necessity. You wake to the familiar scent of cooling embers mixed with fresh bread rising from somewhere below. The kitchen has already come to life, and although most guests are still asleep, someone is feeding the fire, kneading dough, and preparing the first meal of the day with movements refined by years of repetition. Long before clocks ruled daily life, people measured time by habit, light, and labor. The loft slowly stirs as another traveler sits upright, rubbing tired eyes before reaching for his boots. Across the room, the merchant carefully inspects the leather straps securing his bundles, while the pilgrim folds his blanket with quiet precision, leaving the sleeping place almost exactly as he had found it. Every action reflects an unwritten understanding that respect for the inn ensured respect from those who managed it. You stretch aching muscles and feel yesterday's journey lingering in your legs. The stiffness is expected rather than surprising, a reminder that medieval travel demanded patience as much as endurance, especially when nearly every mile was covered on foot or horseback. Roads connected kingdoms, but they rarely offered comfort. Descending the staircase, you discover that the common room has changed completely overnight. The tables have been wiped clean, fresh rushes have been scattered across sections of the floor, and the innkeeper is already arranging coarse wooden bowls beside a basket filled with warm loaves whose crusts still crackle softly as they cool. The building seems to have awakened before any of its guests. The innkeeper greets you with the same calm expression he wore the evening before, though his day has clearly been underway for hours. He pours a small cup of warm pottage and slices a generous piece of bread without needing to ask what you would like, because breakfast is determined less by preference than by whatever the kitchen has prepared before dawn. Simplicity keeps both the household and its travelers moving. As you take your seat near the fire, more guests gradually fill the benches around you. Their conversations are different from those of the previous evening, no longer focused on stories already lived, but on distances still to be covered, bridges to be crossed, markets to be reached, and weather that could alter every carefully planned route before midday. Morning belongs to expectation rather than reflection. One traveler quietly unfolds a piece of rough parchment covered with notes made during previous journeys. Instead of detailed maps, he relies on remembered landmarks, village names, and advice gathered from countless conversations inside inns much like this one, because reliable maps are rare and expensive, while local knowledge often proves far more valuable. How many successful journeys depended not upon roads themselves, but upon the people willing to describe them. Outside, the first rays of sunlight finally touch the stable roof, bringing the courtyard to life. Horses stamp impatiently as stable hands prepare saddles. Chickens wander confidently between wagon wheels searching for scattered grain, and a thin mist lifts slowly from the surrounding fields, revealing another ordinary day that feels untouched by history, even though history is unfolding within it. The greatest chapters of the Middle Ages were often written in places exactly like this. Standing near the doorway, you pause for one final look at the inn before continuing your own journey. Only after spending a single night beneath its roof do you begin to appreciate that these humble buildings formed invisible links between towns, castles, monasteries, and distant kingdoms, carrying travelers, merchants, pilgrims, and news across an entire continent. As you step back onto the road, another question quietly follows you. What unexpected encounters might await before the next welcoming fire appears on the horizon? The road stretches ahead beneath a pale morning sky, still damp from the night's cool air. Behind you, the inn slowly disappears into the distance, its chimney sending a thin ribbon of smoke above the rooftops until even that familiar landmark fades into the rolling countryside. A traveler rarely lingered where the journey itself demanded constant movement. Your boots settle into a steady rhythm as fields unfold on either side of the narrow track. Farmers have already begun their work, guiding simple wooden plows through dark soil while oxen pull with patient determination, their slow pace reminding you that nearly every harvest depended more upon endurance than speed. The landscape appears peaceful, yet every season carried its own uncertainties. Passing a small cottage, you notice a woman drawing water from a communal well while two children gather bundles of firewood stacked against a stone wall. Their morning unfolds with quiet purpose, each task repeated so often that it has become almost instinctive, revealing how deeply daily survival depended upon routines passed from one generation to the next. For most people, history was not made in castles, but in moments exactly like these. Farther along the road, fresh wagon tracks cut deeply into the soft earth, crossing paths with countless footprints left by travelers who passed before dawn. Some impressions belong to heavy horses, others to narrow cart wheels carrying goods toward distant markets, each mark offering silent evidence that these roads never truly rested, even when they appeared empty. Every journey became part of a much larger network that connected villages, towns, and kingdoms. The morning breeze carries unfamiliar sounds from somewhere beyond the next rise. At first they seem no more than scattered echoes, but with every step they grow clearer until the unmistakable rhythm of hammer striking iron reaches your ears, followed by the distant murmur of many voices gathered in one place. Could another settlement already be waiting just beyond the hill, or is something more unusual drawing people together so early in the day? As you continue forward, the road widens enough for two wagons to pass comfortably side by side. A group of merchants approaches from the opposite direction, their horses loaded with tightly bound bundles of cloth, barrels secured with iron hoops, and carefully wrapped crates whose contents remain hidden beneath layers of canvas. Their pace is deliberate rather than hurried, for damaged goods could mean the loss of an entire season's profit. One of the merchants raises a hand in greeting as your paths briefly cross. There is no lengthy conversation, only a few exchanged words about the condition of the road ahead, and a warning that recent rains have softened parts of the route farther east. Advice offered freely because every traveler understood that shared information could save days of unnecessary hardship. Trust, even between strangers, often traveled alongside necessity. The sounds ahead continue growing stronger until the outline of another village gradually emerges through the lifting mist. Low timber houses cluster around a modest square. Smoke rises from several chimneys at once, and colorful awnings begin appearing beside wooden stalls that are only now being assembled for the day's trade. The quiet road is giving way to a place filled with movement, commerce, and opportunity. You slow your pace without realizing it, drawn toward the growing activity before you. Somewhere within that gathering crowd are craftsmen, farmers, pilgrims, traders, and storytellers, each carrying experiences from different corners of the medieval world, all meeting for a few brief hours before continuing in separate directions. Every market offered far more than goods for sale. It became a crossroads where news, ideas, and fortunes quietly changed hands. As you step toward the edge of the marketplace, The smell of fresh bread mingles with wood smoke and newly cut timber, while voices rise gently above the clatter of wagons arriving one after another. The day has only just begun, yet you can already sense that this ordinary village holds another window into everyday medieval life, inviting you to look beyond the grand legends and discover the remarkable stories hidden within the routines of ordinary people. The marketplace awakens with remarkable calm, never exploding into noise but gradually gathering life as though the village itself is stretching after a night's rest. Merchants finish raising simple canvas awnings while farmers arrive with handcarts loaded with vegetables, baskets of apples, wheels of cheese, and bundles of herbs still carrying the cool scent of the morning fields. Nothing appears hurried, because everyone understands that the market will remain open until the light begins to fade. You slow your pace, allowing yourself to become another face within the growing crowd. There is no gate to pass through, no announcement of your arrival, only the quiet acceptance that every traveler brings news, trade, or another pair of listening ears. In places like this, strangers often became the first source of information from lands that local people would never see with their own eyes. A baker removes the first loaves from a clay oven built against the side of a timber house. Their crusts crack softly as cool air meets fresh bread, and before long a small line forms without anyone needing direction, each customer patiently waiting while exchanging brief greetings with neighbors they have known for years. Bread is more than food here. It is the foundation of nearly every meal and one of the first tasks completed each morning. Across the square, a cooper examines a wooden barrel beneath the morning sun. He taps each iron hoop with a small hammer, listening carefully to the sound before making tiny adjustments that most people would never notice. A well-made barrel could preserve ale, wine, salted fish, grain, or water for weeks, making the cooper's work essential to everyday life, even if few travelers pause to appreciate the skill behind it. Not far away, the steady rhythm of iron striking iron echoes from a small blacksmith's forge. Sparks leap into the cool air each time the hammer falls, while villagers patiently wait with horseshoes, broken hinges, worn tools, and wagon fittings that cannot wait another day. The blacksmith does far more than shape metal. He keeps the village itself in motion. You pause near the forge, watching as a horse calmly lifts one hoof at the smith's gentle command. With practiced hands, the old horseshoe is removed, the hoof carefully trimmed, and a newly shaped shoe fitted with remarkable precision, each nail driven confidently into the outer wall without causing pain to the animal. How many journeys reach their destination simply because a skilled blacksmith took pride in work that most people never remembered? Children weave between the adults with the effortless confidence of those who know every corner of the village. One carries a basket far too large for his small arms. Another chases a goose that has wandered away from its owner, while two sisters stop briefly beside a cloth merchant, fascinated by bolts of bright fabric they may never wear themselves. Even ordinary mornings contain quiet moments that reveal the rhythm of an entire society. Near the center of the square, a traveling peddler carefully unfolds his goods upon a rough wool blanket spread directly across the ground. Bone combs, sewing needles, tiny bronze buckles, ribbons, wax candles, and polished beads catch the growing sunlight, each inexpensive object attracting curious hands before coins ever appear. For many villagers, these wandering merchants brought rare items that local craftsmen simply did not produce. The conversations around you flow in many directions at once. One farmer worries about the coming harvest if the rains continue. Another celebrates the birth of a healthy calf, while an elderly woman quietly tells her neighbor that a physician is expected to arrive within the week from a nearby town. None of these stories will ever appear in royal chronicles, yet together they form the true heartbeat of the medieval world. You continue walking through the market without any particular destination, allowing curiosity to guide each step instead of necessity. The great kings and famous battles of history seem strangely distant here, replaced by simpler concerns that determine whether families will eat well, whether tools will last another season, and whether the coming winter will be kind. Perhaps this is the greatest surprise of all. The Middle Ages were not lived inside castles, but in places exactly like this, where ordinary people quietly shaped history without ever expecting their names to be remembered. The village square slowly grows busier as the morning advances, yet its activity never feels chaotic. Instead, every person seems to understand where they belong, moving with the confidence of routines repeated through countless seasons, while the sound of conversation blends naturally with the creaking of wagons and the occasional call of livestock waiting patiently beside their owners. It is a quiet harmony, shaped not by rules written on parchment, but by generations of shared experience. A farmer unloads several woven baskets filled with eggs, placing each one carefully upon a simple wooden table. Nearby, another displays smoked meats suspended from a sturdy frame, allowing customers to inspect the quality before making a purchase, while the scent of cured oak smoke drifts gently through the cool air. Every product reflects weeks or months of careful labor long before it reaches the marketplace. You notice that very little money changes hands immediately. Many villagers pause to discuss prices, exchange news, or inspect goods before making any agreement, and in several cases no coins appear at all, as cheese is traded for grain, leather for tools, or cloth for carefully measured sacks of flour. Barter remains woven into everyday life, especially in smaller communities where trust often carries greater value than silver. An elderly woman invites you to sample a small piece of fresh cheese before you continue on your way. It is surprisingly mild, made only a few days earlier from the milk of sheep grazing nearby, and she smiles quietly as you thank her, never pressing you to buy anything. Hospitality and commerce often stand side by side, making every transaction feel less like a negotiation and more like a conversation between neighbors. Across the square, a young apprentice struggles to carry a bundle of firewood almost as tall as himself. His master notices immediately, setting aside his own work long enough to help reposition the heavy load rather than carrying it himself, offering a few calm words of instruction before returning to his bench. Skills are rarely taught through lengthy explanations here. They are learned through observation, repetition, and patience. A bell rings somewhere beyond the marketplace, soft enough that conversation does not stop, but clear enough that nearly everyone turns their head for a brief moment. The sound comes from the village church, whose modest stone tower rises above the surrounding rooftops, reminding everyone that the rhythm of the day is measured as much by faith as by sunlight. Even those who continue working acknowledge the familiar signal almost without thinking. You follow the narrow lane leading toward the churchyard, where the atmosphere changes almost immediately. The lively voices of the market fade behind you, replaced by quieter footsteps upon worn stone paths, and the gentle flutter of birds resting among ancient trees whose branches cast moving shadows across the ground. The transition feels less like leaving one place than entering another state of mind. The church itself is smaller than many travelers might imagine, built from rough local stone weathered by generations of wind and rain. Its walls bear the marks of countless repairs, each one preserving the building rather than replacing it, while a heavy oak door stands slightly open, welcoming anyone seeking a few moments of silence regardless of wealth or social standing. Magnificent cathedrals may have dominated great cities, but churches like this formed the spiritual heart of thousands of ordinary villages. Stepping inside, your eyes need several moments to adjust to the dim interior. Narrow windows admit only thin shafts of morning light that drift through faint traces of incense lingering from an earlier service, illuminating worn wooden benches polished smooth by centuries of hands and clothing. Every surface suggests continual use rather than decoration, reminding you that this is a place built for everyday devotion. An elderly priest quietly arranges handwritten pages upon a simple lectern near the altar. Seeing you enter, he offers nothing more than a warm nod before returning to his work, understanding that not every visitor arrives with questions that require spoken answers. Sometimes the greatest kindness offered to a traveler is simply a peaceful place to rest before continuing a long and uncertain road. You remain there for several quiet moments, listening to the remarkable stillness that fills the building between distant sounds from the village outside. It becomes easy to understand why so many travelers paused in places like this, not only for prayer, but also for reflection, allowing both body and mind to recover before facing another stretch of unfamiliar country. Yet as you leave the church and return toward the marketplace, a larger question begins to form. If a village like this could thrive through cooperation and routine, what would life feel like inside one of the great medieval cities where thousands of strangers lived side by side? The question lingers in your thoughts as you make your way back toward the road, leaving the village behind. The quiet order of country life has revealed one side of the medieval world. Yet beyond these scattered fields stand places where thousands of people crowd behind towering walls, where every street tells a different story, and where opportunity and danger often walk side by side. The road ahead promises that before long, you will witness that contrast for yourself. By mid-morning, the countryside begins to change almost without notice. The open farmland slowly gives way to thicker woodland, where ancient oaks stretch their heavy branches across the road, filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns that dance across the earth beneath your feet. The air grows cooler beneath the canopy, carrying the scent of damp leaves and moss instead of freshly turned soil. Travelers instinctively become more attentive in forests like these. The danger is not that every woodland hides outlaws waiting behind the trees, as popular legends often suggest, but that isolation leaves little room for help should an accident occur. A broken wagon axle, a frightened horse, or even a twisted ankle can transform an ordinary journey into a difficult struggle long before another traveler happens to pass. You notice small cuts carved into the bark of several trees standing beside the path. They are not random marks, but simple guides left by foresters, merchants, or local villagers who know these woods well, helping others remain on the correct route even after heavy rain has washed away will tracks beneath the soft earth. Long before painted signposts became common, knowledge of the landscape itself served as the most reliable guide. Far ahead, the steady sound of hoofbeats slowly approaches. Within moments, 3 mounted riders emerge between the trees, their horses moving at an unhurried pace while leather saddlebags sway gently with every step. They acknowledge you with polite nods before continuing without stopping. Each man clearly accustomed to meeting strangers whose destinations remain unknown. Their clothing suggests modest prosperity rather than nobility. Well-made wool cloaks protect them from the cool air, sturdy leather boots show the wear of many journeys, and each rider carries practical equipment instead of ornate decoration. Medieval travel often rewarded preparation far more than wealth. As silence returns to the forest, birds gradually resume their songs from the branches overhead. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker strikes rhythmically against an old tree while squirrels dart between trunks collecting food for seasons yet to come, seemingly indifferent to the travelers passing beneath them. Nature follows its own timeless routine regardless of the kingdoms that rise and fall beyond its borders. The road begins a gentle climb until the trees thin once again, revealing an unexpected view stretching across the valley below. In the distance, surrounded by cultivated fields and winding streams, stands a fortified town enclosed within high stone walls that catch the afternoon sunlight with remarkable clarity. Even from this distance, you can see narrow towers rising above the rooftops and a gate through which an endless procession of carts, riders, and pedestrians quietly flows. Unlike the peaceful village you left behind, this settlement never appears truly still. Smoke rises from dozens of chimneys, church bells drift faintly across the valley, and movement continues along the walls where guards patrol with patient regularity, reminding every visitor that security remains one of the greatest privileges any medieval town can offer. Behind those walls lies not only protection, but commerce, law, craftsmanship, and countless lives woven together within remarkably little space. You pause on the hillside to absorb the scene before continuing. Generations of travelers must have stood in this very place, feeling the same mixture of relief and anticipation after days spent crossing lonely roads, knowing that a town of this size could provide fresh supplies, skilled craftsmen, reliable lodging, and news arriving from distant regions. Yet entering such a place also means stepping into a world governed by customs entirely different from those of the countryside. As the sun climbs higher and the valley grows brighter beneath its light, you resume your descent toward the massive gate standing open in the distance. Somewhere inside those stone walls, merchants from distant lands bargain over valuable goods. Apprentices learn trades that will shape the rest of their lives. Scribes preserve knowledge upon fragile parchment, and ordinary families begin another afternoon much like countless others before it. The closer you come to the walls, the more impressive they appear. What seemed modest from the distant hillside now rises high above the surrounding fields, built from layers of carefully fitted stone that have withstood generations of harsh winters, political unrest, and determined armies. Their purpose is unmistakable: to convince any approaching enemy that turning back would be wiser than pressing forward. A shallow river bends around part of the town before disappearing beneath a sturdy stone bridge leading directly toward the main gate. Farmers arriving from nearby villages patiently guide their wagons across its worn surface, while shepherds move small flocks through a separate entrance to avoid blocking the growing line of merchants waiting to enter. Every movement follows an order that has developed through years of daily repetition rather than written instruction alone. Standing beside the gateway are two guards wearing quilted gambesons beneath coats, displaying the colors of the local lord. Their spears rest comfortably in practiced hands as they exchange greetings with familiar faces, occasionally asking newcomers about the purpose of their visit, though the conversations remain brief and respectful. Contrary to popular imagination, not every medieval gate resembled a battlefield checkpoint. Much of the time it functioned as the front door to a busy community. You finally pass beneath the great archway, where the temperature drops noticeably as thick stone surrounds you on every side. Above your head, heavy oak doors reinforced with iron bands remain fully open, their immense weight hinting at the effort required to close them before nightfall. For just a few moments, you walk through the very threshold, separating the uncertainty of the open road from the ordered life protected within the walls. As daylight returns on the opposite side of the gate, an entirely different world unfolds before your eyes. Narrow streets branch away in every direction. Timber-framed houses lean gently toward one another across the lanes. Colorful shop signs sway above busy doorways, and the rich mixture of voices, footsteps, bells, and distant hammer blows creates a living tapestry unlike anything you have experienced since beginning your journey. You have entered the beating heart of a medieval town, and every corner promises another remarkable glimpse into a world that still feels astonishingly alive. The city seems to breathe with a rhythm entirely its own. Every narrow lane carries a different mixture of sounds, scents, and voices, blending into a constant murmur that never becomes overwhelming. While sunlight slips between the upper stories of timber houses that lean so close together, they almost appear to greet one another across the street. Unlike the open countryside, where silence often accompanies every mile, life here surrounds you from every direction. You move slowly, allowing yourself to absorb the details that many local residents no longer notice. Shopkeepers are already arranging their goods outside wooden storefronts. Apprentices sweep yesterday's dust into the gutters, and women pause briefly at shared wells before continuing toward their homes with heavy buckets balanced effortlessly in practiced hands. Every ordinary action reveals years of habit shaped by the demands of urban life. The streets themselves are far narrower than modern visitors usually imagine. Many are barely wide enough for a single loaded wagon, forcing pedestrians, horses, and merchants to negotiate space with quiet patience rather than speed, while the uneven cobblestones beneath your feet bear the polished marks of countless generations who have walked the same routes. Every stone has been worn smooth by history rather than time alone. A faint fragrance of fresh bread soon draws your attention toward a nearby bakery. The baker works beside the glowing mouth of a large brick oven, sliding loaves onto broad wooden paddles before placing them carefully upon waiting shelves, where customers inspect each one with experienced eyes rather than hurried hands. Bread is purchased almost daily because few households possess ovens large enough to bake efficiently on their own. Next door, a tailor sits beside an open window where daylight offers the clearest view of his work. His needle moves steadily through layers of dyed wool, while an apprentice carefully measures cloth for a customer whose new tunic must be ready before an approaching religious festival, demonstrating that clothing is often repaired, altered, and reused many times before ever being discarded. Fabric represents both necessity and considerable expense. The further you walk, the more specialized each street becomes. One quarter is filled with leatherworkers whose workshops carry the unmistakable scent of treated hides, Another is occupied by metal craftsmen shaping locks, hinges, and cooking utensils, while farther ahead the rhythmic tapping of stone masons echoes between the buildings like a familiar heartbeat. Medieval towns often organized trades together, making it easier for customers to find skilled artisans while allowing craftsmen to share tools, knowledge, and suppliers. You pause outside the workshop of a bookbinder, surprised to discover such careful work hidden within a modest building. Sheets of parchment rest beneath smooth wooden boards while leather covers are pressed around handwritten pages copied patiently by scribes. Every volume representing months of labor before a single reader ever turns its first page. In an age before printing, every book remains a remarkable achievement. A young apprentice notices your curiosity and smiles before returning to his task. He applies warm glue along the spine of a manuscript with astonishing concentration, aware that a single careless movement could damage work that another craftsman spent weeks preparing, and his quiet dedication reminds you that mastery in the medieval world is earned through years of observation rather than shortcuts. Great skill begins with countless ordinary mornings. As you continue deeper into the town, the buildings gradually grow taller and the streets more crowded. Above many doorways hang brightly painted wooden signs displaying boots, keys, barrels, candles, scissors, or shields instead of written names, allowing both residents and travelers to identify workshops immediately regardless of whether they can read. Every sign tells a story before a single word is spoken. Near a small crossroads, a public fountain attracts a constant stream of townspeople carrying buckets, pitchers, and wooden casks. Water flows steadily from a carved stone spout into a broad basin polished smooth by centuries of use, while conversations begin and end naturally as neighbors pause to fill their containers before continuing with the day's responsibilities. Places like this serve not only practical needs, but also quietly strengthen the social life of the community. The deeper you wander, the clearer one truth becomes. Medieval towns are not chaotic collections of random buildings, but carefully functioning communities where every occupation depends upon another. From the miller who grinds grain to the baker who prepares bread, from the carpenter who repairs wagons to the merchant who carries finished goods far beyond the city walls. Looking around, you begin to understand that the strength of a medieval town lies not in its stone fortifications, but in the countless ordinary people whose daily work keeps every street alive. A distant bell suddenly rings with a deeper tone than those you heard in the village. People neither panic nor stop what they are doing, yet many instinctively glance toward the highest point of the town, where the great church tower rises above every surrounding roof. Whatever is about to happen has clearly become part of the city's familiar routine, but for a newcomer like you, it offers another invitation to discover the hidden rhythms that shape life behind medieval walls. The bell rings a second time, its deep voice rolling across the rooftops before dissolving into the morning air. This time, you notice that many shopkeepers pause only briefly before returning to their work, while a handful of apprentices quietly gather their tools and begin walking uphill toward the great church. Whatever the signal means, it is woven so naturally into daily life that no one feels the need to explain it. You decide to follow at a respectful distance, climbing the gently rising street paved with stones polished by centuries of footsteps. As the houses become larger and more carefully built, carved beams appear beneath the upper floors, painted shutters brighten several windows, and small gardens enclosed by wooden fences soften the edges of the busy town. Prosperity reveals itself here not through extravagance, but through careful craftsmanship maintained over generations. The church dominates the skyline long before you reach its entrance. Its square tower rises confidently above every surrounding building, while rows of narrow arched windows allow shafts of light to spill into the vast interior hidden behind thick stone walls. Unlike the modest village church you visited earlier, this building serves an entire community whose population has steadily grown with trade and opportunity. Crossing the threshold, you instinctively lower your voice despite no one asking you to do so. Sunlight filters through colored glass, scattering muted shades of red, blue, and gold across the stone floor, while the scent of beeswax candles lingers beneath the high vaulted ceiling where every whisper seems to travel far beyond its speaker. The silence here is not empty. it feels carefully preserved. Several townspeople kneel quietly in prayer before beginning another day's work. Others simply sit for a few peaceful moments with their heads lowered, allowing themselves a brief pause before returning to workshops, markets, and family responsibilities, reminding you that these buildings offered more than religious ceremonies. They provided rare moments of stillness within lives shaped by constant labor. Near one of the side aisles, an elderly mason studies a section of weathered stone that has recently begun to crack. Beside him, a younger apprentice listens carefully as the older craftsman explains how each replacement block must match the original so closely that future generations will never notice where old work ends and new work begins. Preserving a great building demands as much patience as constructing it. You continue exploring until your attention is drawn toward a series of carved figures decorating one of the interior columns. Saints, craftsmen, farmers, kings, shepherds, and ordinary villagers appear side by side, their expressions softened by centuries of gentle wear, quietly reminding every visitor that sacred spaces were also places where everyday life found representation. History here belongs not only to rulers, but to the people who built, repaired, and prayed within these walls. A soft voice nearby begins reading from a handwritten manuscript while a small group listens attentively. The pages are illuminated with delicate colors and careful lettering that required weeks, sometimes months, to complete, each line copied patiently by hand in an age when every written word carried remarkable value. Books remain uncommon treasures, and hearing one read aloud allows knowledge to reach far beyond those able to read for themselves. Leaving the church, you find the streets brighter than before as the afternoon sun climbs higher above the rooftops. The marketplace has become even livelier, with new wagons arriving through the city gate and fresh goods appearing upon wooden stalls, while musicians gather near a fountain, their simple melodies drifting effortlessly through the surrounding lanes. Commerce and community continue side by side, without ever seeming to compete. Following the music, you discover a small open square where a storyteller has already attracted a modest crowd. Children sit cross-legged upon the ground, adults remain standing with folded arms, and even passing merchants slow their pace for a few moments, proving that stories possess a remarkable ability to pause the busiest day. Long before printed books became common, tales carried history, wisdom, entertainment, and memory from one generation to the next. The storyteller begins not with a battle or a king, but with the journey of an ordinary traveler who finds himself welcomed by strangers in a distant town after days spent crossing lonely roads. As the listeners lean closer, smiling at familiar details drawn from everyday life, you cannot help noticing how easily people recognize themselves within simple stories. Perhaps that is why such tales endured for centuries, not because they celebrated extraordinary heroes, but because they reflected the quiet experiences shared by almost everyone. As the afternoon shadows gradually lengthen across the square, another realization quietly settles over you. Every street you have walked, every workshop you have entered, and every conversation you have overheard has revealed a different thread in the fabric of medieval life. Yet you have explored only a fraction of what lies within these walls. And somewhere beyond the crowded market, hidden among winding alleys that few visitors ever notice, another chapter of the city is waiting to reveal itself. The narrow lane leading away from the storyteller's square is easy to overlook. Wedged between two weathered timber buildings, it appears little more than a service passage. Yet as you step inside, the sounds of the bustling marketplace fade with surprising speed, replaced by the quieter rhythm of craftsmen absorbed in their work. It is here, away from the busiest streets, that much of the town's true character quietly reveals itself. Sunlight filters through the upper floors in thin golden bands, illuminating suspended particles of sawdust drifting lazily through the air. The scent of freshly cut oak mingles with warm beeswax and drying leather, creating an atmosphere that speaks not of commerce alone, but of countless hours devoted to mastering practical skills. Every doorway opens onto another workshop where experience is measured in years rather than words. From one open window comes the steady scrape of a plane smoothing a rough plank into polished timber. Inside, An elderly carpenter works beside two apprentices who watch every movement with careful attention, knowing that their lessons come less from formal instruction than from observing hands that have repeated the same motions for decades. In medieval workshops, patience is often the first craft a young apprentice must learn. The master pauses only briefly to examine the grain of a newly prepared board before marking it with a piece of charcoal. He explains that wood must always be understood before it is shaped, since every tree grows differently, and forcing the material instead of respecting it almost always ends in failure. His words are simple, yet they reflect a philosophy shared by many skilled craftsmen throughout the Middle Ages. Farther along the lane, a narrow doorway leads into the workshop of a candle maker. Long wooden racks support rows of freshly dipped candles hanging upside down, while the rich scent of warm beeswax fills the room, reminding you that artificial light remains one of the most valuable comforts available after sunset. Before electricity transformed the world, every evening depended upon careful preparation during daylight hours. The candle maker patiently repeats the same movement over and over, dipping each wick into melted wax before allowing another thin layer to cool. One coat alone would produce almost nothing, but dozens of careful repetitions gradually create the sturdy candles that will illuminate homes, churches, monasteries, and inns throughout the surrounding countryside. Could any invention seem more ordinary today, while having once been so essential to everyday life? Across the lane, another craftsman sits before a spinning wheel where loose wool is slowly transformed into smooth thread. His daughter gathers finished yarn into carefully wound skeins, while his wife inspects dyed fabric drying beneath a covered awning, each member of the household contributing naturally to the family's livelihood. Many medieval workshops are not businesses in the modern sense, but family homes where daily life and skilled labor exist side by side. Children occasionally dart through the lane carrying messages between neighboring workshops. One delivers a newly sharpened chisel to the carpenter, another brings a wrapped bundle of leather straps to the cooper, and a third hurries toward the bakery balancing a small basket filled with empty wooden bowls waiting to be returned. Even the youngest members of the community gradually become part of the town's intricate rhythm. As you continue walking, the sounds begin to change once again. The sharp blows of hammers become less frequent, replaced by quieter voices drifting from nearby courtyards where neighbors share the afternoon meal beneath climbing vines and flowering herbs, enjoying the brief pause before work resumes. Life inside the town is not divided between labor and rest, but flows naturally between the two throughout the day. One courtyard catches your attention because its entrance gate remains open. An elderly woman carefully tends a small herb garden growing beside a stone wall, while a pot simmers gently over a modest outdoor fire, filling the air with the comforting aroma of onions, parsley, and barley. The garden occupies only a few square yards, yet it provides medicines, seasonings, and fresh ingredients that improve daily life far beyond its size. She notices your curiosity and smiles before inviting you closer. Without any expectation of payment, she explains the purpose of several familiar plants, pointing to sage for sore throats, mint for unsettled stomachs, and rosemary believed to strengthen memory, knowledge gathered through generations of observation rather than written instruction. Long before pharmacies appeared on busy streets, gardens like these served as quiet centers of practical healing. As you thank her and return to the winding lane, the afternoon sun begins its slow descent toward the western horizon. Shadows stretch farther across the cobblestones. Craftsmen prepare to finish the day's final tasks, and shopkeepers glance toward the sky with the practiced awareness of people whose schedules still follow the movement of the sun rather than the hands of a clock. The city is changing once again, preparing for an evening that will reveal an entirely different side of medieval life. In the distance, another bell echoes softly across the rooftops. This one is lighter, almost welcoming, and as people begin closing shutters, gathering tools, and lighting the first lanterns of the evening, you sense that the town is about to exchange the energy of commerce for the warmth of community. And when darkness settles over the streets, the stories shared beside glowing hearths may prove every bit as memorable as the work accomplished beneath the afternoon sun. The first lanterns begin to glow one after another as daylight slips quietly behind the rooftops. Their warm light spills through open doorways onto the cobblestones, softening the sharp edges of the busy streets that only hours earlier echoed with trade and negotiation, while the city settles into a slower rhythm that belongs entirely to the evening. It is almost as though the town reveals a different personality once the day's work has finally been laid aside. Workshop doors close with familiar creaks as masters inspect the final pieces completed before sunset. Apprentices sweep wood shavings, metal filings, and scraps of cloth into neat piles before carefully storing valuable tools inside locked chests, understanding that replacing a damaged hammer or finely crafted chisel may require weeks of labor. Every object inside these workshops represents time as much as material. The blacksmith allows the forge to cool gradually rather than extinguishing it completely. A deep red glow remains beneath the ash, ready to be awakened before dawn with fresh charcoal and patient hands, saving precious time when another day begins. Medieval craftsmen learned to think not only about today's work, but also about tomorrow's. Families emerge into the streets carrying small baskets filled with the evening meal. Some visit relatives living only a few houses away, while others gather in shared courtyards where neighbors exchange bread, soup, and quiet conversation beneath the fading light, creating an atmosphere that feels remarkably familiar despite the centuries separating their world from yours. Community is not an occasional event here. It is woven into ordinary evenings. You follow the inviting scent of roasted onions and herbs until you reach a modest tavern standing just beyond the marketplace. Unlike the larger roadside inn where your journey began, this establishment serves mostly local residents who know one another well, greeting newcomers with polite curiosity before returning to conversations interrupted only briefly by your arrival. A town tavern becomes less a refuge for travelers than an extension of the surrounding neighborhood. Inside, the room is alive with gentle conversation rather than loud celebration. A cooper laughs quietly with a baker whose flour-dusted sleeves reveal he has only recently finished his day's work, while two carpenters compare measurements scratched on his small wooden tablets, discussing a roof that must be repaired before the coming rains. Even moments of relaxation remain connected to the responsibilities waiting outside. At a corner table sits a man whose appearance immediately captures your attention. His clothing is practical but noticeably worn from long travel, and beside him rests a weathered leather satchel secured with brass buckles that have clearly accompanied him across many difficult roads. Rather than drinking hurriedly, he studies the room with calm familiarity, as though every town offers another page in a journey that has no fixed destination. The innkeeper quietly introduces him as a messenger who carries letters between distant cities several times each season. Unlike royal envoys racing under urgent command, men like him transport ordinary correspondence, contracts, family news, and business agreements, becoming living threads that bind scattered communities together across hundreds of miles. Before reliable postal systems existed, trusted messengers carried far more than parchment. They carried relationships. The traveler notices your interest and gestures toward the empty bench across from him. Without hesitation, he begins describing the roads he has crossed during recent weeks, speaking of flooded river crossings, bustling market towns, quiet monasteries offering shelter to exhausted pilgrims, and mountain passes where spring snow sometimes lingers well into early summer. His stories never seek to impress. They simply reflect the realities of life spent almost entirely on the road. He explains that every experienced traveler keeps a mental map far richer than anything drawn upon parchment. It is a map built from memories of dependable wells, generous inns, dangerous bridges, honest ferrymen, patient blacksmiths, and villages where strangers receive fair treatment without unnecessary suspicion. Such knowledge cannot easily be purchased, only earned one journey at a time. You ask whether he ever grows accustomed to constant travel, expecting an answer filled with adventure. Instead, he smiles thoughtfully before admitting that what changes most is not the road itself, but the traveler's way of seeing it, because after enough years, every landscape becomes connected to a memory. Every crossroads recalls a familiar face, and every distant church tower signals another chapter in a life measured by places rather than possessions. Could that be why so many medieval travelers accepted uncertainty so naturally? Not because the road became easier, but because it slowly became home. Outside, darkness settles fully across the city. Shutters close against the cool evening air, lanterns shimmer behind leaded windows, and the watch begins its steady patrol along the walls, announcing the passing hours with measured voices that drift across the sleeping streets. Tomorrow will bring another market, another sunrise, and another procession of strangers entering through the city gates, each carrying stories that have yet to be told. The messenger's words remain with you long after your conversation comes to a natural end. Rather than speaking like a man chasing excitement, he describes the road with quiet respect, as though every mile has taught him that patience often matters more than speed, and careful observation proves more valuable than confidence alone. It becomes clear that the greatest travelers are rarely those who rush from place to place, but those who truly learn to see the world unfolding around them. The evening inside the tavern deepens, almost unnoticed. Fresh logs settle into the hearth with a shower of glowing sparks. Mugs are quietly refilled, and the gentle hum of conversation rises and falls like distant waves, creating a sense of calm that encourages strangers to linger just a little longer before returning home. There is no urgency here, only the comforting rhythm of another ordinary night. At a nearby table, a group of craftsmen discuss the construction of a new section of the city wall. One explains how the foundations must be laid deeper than most people imagine. Another argues that the quality of the limestone matters more than its appearance, while a third quietly reminds the others that walls are built not only to resist enemies, but to survive generations of wind, frost, and rain. Their discussion reveals that even the strongest fortifications begin with countless practical decisions made by ordinary workers. A mason notices your curiosity and invites you to examine a small carved stone resting beside his chair. It bears the simple mark he leaves upon every block he finishes, not as decoration but as proof of responsibility, allowing the master builder to know exactly who shaped each piece before it became part of a tower, gate, or church. Long before signatures appeared on famous works of art, craftsmen quietly left traces of themselves in the buildings that would outlive them. As darkness settles outside, a watchman passes through the street carrying a lantern suspended from a wooden staff. Every few moments he calls out the passing hour in a calm, measured voice, reassuring the sleeping town that someone remains awake while others rest behind locked doors. Night watches varied from town to town, but their presence offered comfort in communities where fire, theft, and unexpected visitors demanded constant attention. You step outside for a breath of cool evening air. The streets that bustled with merchants only hours ago now belong to small groups returning home beneath the glow of lanterns fixed above doorways, while the moon slowly rises beyond the rooftops, casting pale silver light across the upper walls and narrow towers overlooking the sleeping countryside. The transformation is remarkable, revealing a city that feels both familiar and entirely new. Walking without any destination, you find yourself beside the town wall where a narrow stair leads upward. A guard recognizes your interest and, after a brief exchange, allows you to climb the worn stone steps to the parapet, explaining that many visitors enjoy seeing the town from above before continuing their journeys. Such moments of quiet generosity often leave stronger memories than grand ceremonies. From the top of the wall, the entire settlement unfolds beneath you. Hundreds of warm lights flicker through tiny windows, smoke drifts lazily from chimneys into the cool night sky, and beyond the gates stretches an immense darkness broken only by occasional farmhouses whose distant lanterns resemble scattered stars upon the earth. The contrast between the protected town and the open countryside has never seemed more striking. The guard rests his hands upon the ancient stone while looking toward the horizon. He explains that every evening ends the same way, with the gates secured until dawn, patrols beginning their slow circuits, and travelers arriving too late forced to seek shelter wherever they can beyond the walls. Once the great doors are closed, the town becomes a world unto itself until morning returns. Looking across the quiet rooftops, you begin to understand why medieval walls inspired such confidence. They did far more than keep enemies outside. They created a place where markets could flourish, craftsmen could perfect their trades, families could sleep with greater peace of mind, and knowledge could be preserved from one generation to the next. Within these boundaries, everyday life found the stability it needed to grow. As the night grows colder, you descend from the wall and make your way toward the inn where you intend to spend the night. The streets are nearly empty now, save for the occasional watchman and a few late travelers hurrying toward shelter before the last lamps burn low. Yet as you approach the doorway, you notice a heavily loaded wagon arriving just before the gates are fully secured, its wheels coated with mud from distant roads, and its horses breathing clouds into the crisp night air. Whatever journey has brought those newcomers here, it has clearly begun far beyond the horizon, and with it comes another story waiting to unfold as your own continues. The wagon comes to a gradual halt inside the courtyard just as the heavy city gates close behind it with a deep wooden thud that echoes through the quiet streets. Two weary horses lower their heads in relief while a pair of stable boys hurry forward with practiced movements. Loosening harnesses stiff from a long day's work, and the travelers climb down one after another with the slow, careful motions of people who have spent countless hours upon uneven roads. Their arrival marks the true end of the day's journey, not because they have reached their destination, but because they have finally found a place where tomorrow can wait until sunrise. One traveler unfolds himself from the driver's bench with visible effort before stretching his aching shoulders. His beard is dusted with the pale powder of distant roads, and the hem of his heavy cloak carries dried mud collected from valleys and river crossings many days behind him. Every wrinkle in his clothing speaks not of neglect but of endurance, reminding you that long-distance travel in the medieval world was measured less by miles than by persistence. Without wasting time, the innkeeper welcomes the newcomers exactly as he welcomed you. Questions remain practical rather than personal. How many beds are needed? Are there horses to feed? Does the wagon require shelter before the night's rain arrives? Hospitality follows a familiar pattern because experience has taught every innkeeper that tired travelers first need warmth and food. Stories can wait until later. The wagon itself immediately attracts quiet attention. It is covered by thick waxed canvas secured with sturdy ropes, concealing whatever valuable cargo lies beneath, while iron-bound chests remain fastened with heavy locks despite the apparent safety of the town. Merchants who crossed great distances learned never to abandon caution simply because stone walls surrounded them. As the horses are led toward the stable, one of the drivers carefully inspects each animal beneath the glow of a hanging lantern. He runs his hands gently along their legs, checking for swelling or small cuts that might become serious if ignored, before brushing dried foam from their necks with slow, reassuring movements. Experienced travelers understand that healthy horses often determine whether the next stage of the journey succeeds or fails. Curiosity eventually draws several guests toward the wagon, though everyone keeps a respectful distance. Someone quietly wonders whether the cargo comes from the great cloth towns of Flanders. Another suggests it may contain fine wine from vineyards far to the south, while an elderly merchant simply smiles without offering an opinion, knowing that appearances often hide the truth. In medieval commerce, discretion is frequently as valuable as the goods themselves. After supper, the oldest member of the traveling company finally begins to speak. His voice is calm and unhurried, shaped by years spent telling the same stories beside hundreds of different hearths. Yet each sentence carries the quiet authority of lived experience rather than exaggeration. He explains that their journey began many weeks ago beyond the distant mountains, where prosperous towns produce wool cloth sought by merchants throughout Europe. He describes roads that climb through narrow mountain passes where mist clings to the rocks until late morning, villages where every house seems built from the same gray stone as the surrounding hills, and bridges so ancient that no one remembers who first laid their foundations. None of these places are famous, yet together they form the invisible network that allows people, goods, and ideas to travel across an entire continent. The listeners lean closer, not because the stories contain battles or legendary heroes, but because they reveal places most of them will never see. A cooper imagines the bustling markets beyond the mountains. A baker wonders whether bread tastes different in distant regions, and a young apprentice quietly pictures himself following those same roads one day after completing his training. Travel expands the imagination even for those who never leave home. The merchant smiles at the growing curiosity before reaching into one of his leather bags. Rather than producing jewels or expensive coins, he carefully unfolds a piece of finely woven cloth unlike anything made in the surrounding countryside, allowing everyone to feel its remarkable softness beneath their fingertips. The room falls almost completely silent as the fabric passes from hand to hand, not because it is extravagant, but because it represents the extraordinary skill of craftsmen working hundreds of miles away. He explains that trade rarely moves in only one direction. The cloth he carries will soon be exchanged for locally forged tools, cured leather, barrels, and other products that will accompany him back across the mountains, continuing a cycle that has linked distant regions for generations. Every wagon arriving at a city gate carries far more than merchandise. It carries knowledge, techniques, fashions, and ideas that quietly reshape the communities through which it passes. As the evening grows later, maps become the subject of conversation. One traveler laughs gently at the thought of owning a detailed map of every road, explaining that such luxuries are beyond the reach of almost everyone, while another taps his forehead and says that the finest map any merchant possesses is the one built slowly through memory, conversation, and experience. Every reliable inn, every dependable bridge, every honest ferryman, and every welcoming monastery becomes another landmark stored within the mind. You find yourself listening less to the details of each destination and more to what they reveal about the medieval world itself. It is not a collection of isolated kingdoms separated by wilderness, as many people imagine today, but a landscape connected by countless travelers who spend their lives carrying goods, messages, customs, and news from one community to another. The roads may be slow, but they are never truly empty. Outside, a gentle rain begins to fall upon the rooftops, its steady rhythm blending with the fading crackle of the hearth. The stable has grown quiet. The city gates remain firmly barred until dawn, and one by one the guests retire for the night, leaving only glowing embers to illuminate the common room. Yet as you climb the staircase toward your bed, you cannot help wondering how many remarkable journeys have begun with an evening exactly like this. An ordinary night inside a medieval inn, where strangers meet briefly before carrying pieces of one another's stories toward distant horizons. The rain continues through the night with quiet determination, washing the dust from the streets and filling the gutters with narrow streams that reflect the glow of the last remaining lanterns. From your place beneath the heavy wool blanket, the gentle rhythm against the roof becomes almost hypnotic, reminding you that for countless generations travelers have fallen asleep to exactly the same comforting sound. There is something deeply reassuring about resting inside sturdy walls while the weather carries on beyond them. Before dawn has fully arrived, the inn is already awake once again. Somewhere below, the familiar crackle of a newly lit fire reaches the upper floor, followed by the muffled voices of servants preparing bread, warming porridge, and fetching fresh water from the courtyard well before the city begins to stir. Life inside an inn never truly stops. It simply changes pace between night and morning. You rise quietly, careful not to disturb those still asleep around you. The merchant from the previous evening has already packed his belongings with practiced efficiency, every buckle fastened, every parcel secured exactly where experience has taught him it belongs, while another traveler carefully folds a simple wool blanket before placing it neatly upon the bed he has borrowed for the night. Even temporary guests leave behind a quiet sense of order. Stepping into the courtyard, you discover the town wrapped in cool mist left behind by the night's rain. The cobblestones glisten beneath the first pale light of morning. Horses drink calmly from long wooden troughs, and stable hands move between stalls carrying fresh hay upon their shoulders. The city has not yet become busy, allowing you to witness a quieter side of urban life that many visitors never see. A farrier has already begun examining one of the merchant's horses beneath the shelter of a timber awning. Kneeling beside the patient animal, he carefully cleans each hoof before checking the iron shoes for signs of wear, replacing only those that truly require attention rather than recommending unnecessary work. Reputation, you realize, is one of the most valuable possessions any craftsman can earn. Nearby, wagon wheels receive the same careful inspection. A wheelwright taps each wooden spoke with a small mallet, listening closely to the tone produced before tightening an iron band that loosens slightly during weeks of rough travel. Such small repairs often determine whether a merchant reaches the next town safely or finds himself stranded beside an isolated road many miles from help. Breakfast is served shortly afterward inside the common room. Thick oat porridge, coarse rye bread, soft cheese, and mugs of weak ale provide enough nourishment to sustain another long day's journey, while conversation remains noticeably quieter than the night before. Mornings belong to preparation rather than storytelling. The messenger you met the previous evening joins you for a simple meal before continuing toward another distant town. He unfolds a small piece of parchment listing villages, monasteries, and trading posts where letters await collection, explaining that no single journey ever follows exactly the same route because roads change with the seasons, bridges collapse, rivers flood, and opportunities appear unexpectedly. Flexibility becomes as valuable as careful planning. He smiles before carefully rolling the parchment once more. The road, he says, is always teaching those willing to pay attention. And although the sentence is spoken almost casually, it lingers in your thoughts long after he has fastened his satchel and disappeared through the city gate. Perhaps the greatest education available during the Middle Ages was found not inside schools alone, but across the countless roads connecting people who would otherwise remain strangers forever. After settling your own account with the innkeeper, you step back into the awakening streets. Shopkeepers are lifting heavy shutters, apprentices are carrying water to their workshops, and smoke begins rising once more from dozens of chimneys as another ordinary day quietly unfolds behind the protective walls. Yesterday's visitors have become today's departing travelers, while new faces are already arriving to take their place. Rather than leaving the city immediately, you decide to explore one final district before continuing your own journey. Local residents have spoken repeatedly of the riverside quarter, where mills, warehouses, and docks form the commercial heart of the town, and curiosity urges you to see how goods arriving from distant regions complete the final stage of their long journey. If the marketplace reveals what a city consumes, perhaps the river will reveal how the city survives. Following a gently descending street, you soon hear the unmistakable sound of moving water echoing between rows of stone buildings. The noise grows louder with every step until the streets suddenly open onto a broad river lined with timber wharves, cargo cranes powered by human strength, and warehouses whose heavy oak doors stand open to receive another day's deliveries. The scene before you is alive with purposeful movement, revealing that the prosperity of this medieval town depends not only upon its walls, but upon the flowing water that connects it to the wider world. Watching the river glide steadily beneath an ancient stone bridge, you begin to understand that roads alone never carried medieval civilization. Rivers served as the great highways of Europe, transporting grain, timber, cloth, wine, salt, and countless other necessities far more efficiently than wagons struggling over rough tracks. And as the first cargo boat slowly approaches the quay through the morning mist, another remarkable chapter of everyday medieval life is about to begin. The river is already awake long before the rest of the city reaches its busiest hours. Barges drift slowly with the current while smaller boats weave carefully between them, their crews communicating through familiar hand signals and short calls that echo gently across the water. There is no frantic movement, only the steady confidence of men and women performing tasks refined through years of experience. Standing on the timber quay, you notice how different the atmosphere feels from the marketplace above. Here, conversations are brief and purposeful because every cargo must be unloaded in the correct order, every barrel counted, and every crate inspected before it leaves the waterfront. The river rewards careful organization as much as physical strength. A broad, flat-bottomed barge glides toward the dock with remarkable precision despite its considerable size. Two boatmen guide it using long steering oars while another throws a thick hemp rope toward waiting dock workers, who secure the vessel with practiced movements requiring almost no spoken instruction. Their cooperation appears effortless, yet it reflects countless mornings spent working together. The first cargo to be unloaded consists of tightly bound sacks of grain stacked beneath waterproof coverings. One after another they are lifted onto waiting carts, each marked with a simple merchant seal identifying its owner before disappearing toward nearby warehouses where supplies will remain safe until sold. Grain is never treated casually. for an abundant harvest can sustain a city, while a poor one may shape the fortunes of an entire year. Farther along the quay, another vessel carries heavy barrels secured by stout wooden braces. The cooper supervising their arrival carefully examines every hoop before allowing the barrels to be rolled ashore, understanding that even the smallest crack could ruin valuable wine, ale, or oil transported over great distances. His attention to detail reminds you that medieval commerce depends as much upon craftsmanship as upon trade itself. The air beside the river carries an entirely different collection of scents than those found in the market streets. Fresh timber, damp rope, river water, beeswax, tar, and newly sawn planks mingle together, creating an unmistakable fragrance recognized by anyone whose livelihood depends upon boats and cargo. Every working district possesses its own unique character long before its buildings come into view. Nearby, a large treadwheel crane slowly begins to turn. Inside its enormous wooden wheel, two laborers walk steadily forward, using nothing more than their own weight to raise heavy crates suspended from thick ropes above the dock. To modernize the machine appears surprisingly simple, yet it allows loads far beyond the strength of any individual to be lifted with remarkable control. Medieval engineers often achieved extraordinary results through practical ingenuity rather than mechanical complexity. You watch as a master carpenter carefully inspects a newly delivered shipment of oak beams destined for construction within the city. He studies each piece before marking it with charcoal, separating straight timber suitable for roof trusses from wood better suited for doors, floors, or scaffolding. Nothing is wasted, because every tree represents years of growth that cannot quickly be replaced. Not every arrival brings merchandise alone. A modest passenger boat ties alongside the quay, carrying several pilgrims whose cloaks still glisten with droplets from the morning mist. Their belongings are few, consisting mostly of walking staffs, leather satchels, and rolled blankets. Yet the expressions on their faces reveal the quiet determination shared by countless travelers whose journeys are guided more by faith than by commerce. One elderly pilgrim pauses before stepping onto the dock and quietly thanks the boatman who has carried them safely downstream. No grand ceremony follows, only a simple exchange of gratitude before each person continues toward a different destination. Such brief encounters happen every day, weaving invisible connections between people who may never meet again. A customs clerk sits beneath a covered shelter overlooking the waterfront, recording shipments upon carefully prepared parchment. His work is slow but methodical, ensuring that tolls are collected fairly and merchants receive written acknowledgement of their cargo before entering the city proper. Administration may lack the drama of adventure, yet without records like these the prosperity of many medieval towns would quickly begin to unravel. As the morning advances, the quayside becomes increasingly busy without ever losing its sense of order. Wagons arrive to collect flour destined for local bakeries. Bundles of wool disappear toward the weaver's quarter, and carefully packed chests are loaded onto outbound vessels beginning journeys of their own. Looking around, you realize that the river is not simply a feature beside the city. It is the quiet engine that keeps the entire community alive. Then, just beyond the busiest section of the harbor, something catches your attention. Moored slightly apart from the commercial docks is a long, elegant vessel unlike the broad cargo barges surrounding it. Its hull is painted with fading colors. Its mast carries a banner unfamiliar to the local townspeople, and several sailors speak in a language you do not recognize. Wherever they have come from, they have traveled far beyond the roads and rivers you have explored so far, and their arrival hints that your journey is about to extend well beyond the borders of this familiar kingdom. The unfamiliar vessel rests quietly against the quay, drawing curious glances from local dockworkers who continue their tasks without allowing fascination to interrupt their routine. Its hull is longer and narrower than the broad river barges surrounding it, built not for carrying heavy grain or timber, but for traveling efficiently across open water, while the weathered planks reveal years of service beneath distant skies. Every scratch along its sides tells the story of countless harbors reached and countless storms endured. Its crew moves with remarkable coordination. Sailors coil thick ropes with practiced hands, inspect the rigging high above the deck, and carefully secure bundles wrapped in waxed canvas before anyone considers unloading the cargo. Their language flows quickly between them, unfamiliar to your ears, yet unmistakably confident, proving that the sea creates its own traditions understood by those who spend their lives upon it. Standing nearby is a merchant unlike the traders you have met along the inland roads. His cloak is cut from finely woven cloth dyed a deep blue that has faded slightly beneath years of sunlight, while a small leather ledger hangs from his belt beside a collection of carefully sealed documents. Rather than watching the cargo itself, his attention remains fixed upon the paperwork that accompanies every shipment, because a mistake recorded in ink can prove far more costly than one made aboard the ship. You notice that the first crates unloaded from the vessel are surprisingly small. Two dockworkers carry each chest together despite its modest size, suggesting that whatever lies inside possesses considerable value compared with its weight. No one opens the containers here on the quay. Instead, they are transferred immediately onto waiting carts under the careful supervision of both the merchant and the customs clerk. One of the local warehouse keepers quietly explains that ships arriving from distant ports often carry luxury goods rarely seen in smaller towns. Fine spices measured in handfuls, carefully woven silks, colorful pigments for artists, delicate glassware, beeswax of exceptional quality, and rare writing materials may all travel together inside a cargo that occupies only a fraction of the space required for grain or timber. In medieval commerce, value is not always measured by size. Nearby, another crew unloads tightly packed bundles of raw wool destined for the city's weaving workshops. Unlike the precious chests receiving constant supervision, these bales are handled with speed and efficiency, disappearing into nearby warehouses where they will eventually become cloth, blankets, cloaks, and garments worn by people who will never know where the fibers first began their journey. Every finished object carries with it an invisible history stretching far beyond the place where it is finally used. Watching the activity along the river, you begin to recognize something remarkable. The marketplace reveals the final stage of commerce, where buyers and sellers meet face to face, but the harbor tells a much larger story. Before bread reaches a baker's table, before wool becomes a cloak, before ink touches parchment, dozens of unseen people have already played their part in moving those goods from one corner of Europe to another. A young dock worker pauses beside the edge of the quay, wiping rainwater from his hands before pointing towards several carved symbols burned into the side of a shipping crate. They are not decorative markings, but merchant signs, allowing cargo to be identified quickly regardless of the language spoken by those unloading it. In an age when many people cannot read lengthy documents, simple symbols become an international language understood across countless ports and trading towns. Farther downstream, the steady turning of a large water wheel catches your attention. Its broad wooden paddles dip continuously into the current before rising again with quiet determination, transferring the river's endless movement into useful mechanical power inside a nearby mill. Long before engines transformed industry, flowing water performed much of the heavy labor that human muscles alone could never sustain indefinitely. Inside the mill, enormous millstones rotate with slow precision, grinding grain into flour while the building vibrates gently beneath the steady force transmitted through gears, shafts, and wooden cogs. The miller constantly adjusts the distance between the stones, knowing that flour ground too finely or too coarsely can greatly affect the quality of the bread baked throughout the city. Such work demands experience rather than brute strength. You ask how often the mill operates, expecting it to close once enough flour has been prepared. The miller smiles before explaining that as long as grain continues arriving from surrounding farms and the river continues flowing, the wheel rarely stands still for very long. Harvest seasons may determine the volume of work, but the demand for bread never truly disappears. Leaving the riverside behind, you climb a gently rising street that offers one final view across the harbor. Boats continue arriving and departing with the quiet regularity of passing seasons. Wagons disappear through warehouse gates, and merchants record transactions that will influence journeys extending hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. It becomes increasingly clear that medieval towns did not prosper through isolation. They flourished because they stood at the meeting point of roads, rivers, and people whose lives became connected in ways few of them could fully appreciate. As you reach the crest of the hill, The afternoon light spreads across the rooftops, church towers, workshops, and bustling quays below, revealing the city as a single living organism whose countless parts depend upon one another. Yet beyond the northern gate, rising faintly in the distance above forests and cultivated fields, another silhouette begins to emerge against the sky. It is not another town, nor a monastery, but the unmistakable outline of a great stone castle standing upon a commanding hill, a place built not for trade or daily labor, but for power, protection, and the authority that shaped the medieval world for centuries. The castle remains little more than a distant silhouette for now, its towers softened by the afternoon haze, yet even from miles away it commands the landscape with quiet authority. Perched upon a rocky hill above the surrounding countryside, it overlooks rivers, roads, and fields that stretch toward the horizon, reminding every traveler that these fortresses were never built by chance. Their position alone reveals centuries of careful planning. You decide that the castle can wait another day. Great fortresses are best appreciated without haste, and there is still much to discover within the city whose streets have already revealed so many layers of medieval life. Sometimes the most remarkable stories are found not at the summit of a hill, but in the quiet corners hidden beneath its shadow. Turning away from the northern gate, you wander into a district where the streets become noticeably wider. Here, the houses belong to prosperous merchants whose success has transformed simple timber homes into impressive residences featuring carved balconies, glazed windows, and enclosed courtyards protected by sturdy oak gates. Wealth announces itself quietly through craftsmanship rather than extravagance. Servants move between the houses carrying baskets filled with vegetables, loaves of fresh bread, and earthenware jugs of ale drawn from nearby breweries. Deliveries arrive steadily throughout the afternoon, revealing that even the wealthiest households remain dependent upon the same network of bakers, farmers, millers, and craftsmen that supports every resident of the city. Prosperity changes comfort, but it rarely changes dependence. One large residence catches your attention because its front doors stand open. Through the entrance hall you glimpse shelves lined with ledgers, rolled parchments tied with colored cords, and wooden chests fitted with heavy iron locks. Rather than serving only as a family home, the building also functions as the headquarters of a merchant whose business reaches far beyond the city walls. Inside, two clerks sit at a long oak table copying figures into carefully ruled account books. Every shipment arriving at the river, every wagon leaving through the city gates, and every payment promised for future deliveries is recorded with remarkable precision. Long before modern banks and corporations existed, commercial trust depended upon accurate records maintained by patient hands. The merchant himself studies a map spread across the table. Unlike the detailed maps familiar today, it shows only the most important rivers, major towns, mountain passes, and trading routes, leaving vast areas almost empty. Yet for someone who understands the roads through experience, these simple markings contain everything needed to plan journeys lasting several months. He notices your interest and smiles warmly before inviting you closer. Tracing one finger across the parchment, he explains that successful trade depends less upon finding the shortest route than upon choosing the safest and most reliable one, because a single washed-out bridge or closed mountain pass can delay an entire caravan for weeks. Every decision balances opportunity against risk. His explanation naturally turns toward the changing seasons. During spring, swollen rivers often make crossings unpredictable. Summer brings dusty roads crowded with merchants and pilgrims. Autumn offers excellent conditions for transporting harvests, while winter can isolate entire regions beneath snow or deep mud. Medieval commerce follows the calendar as faithfully as farmers follow the harvest. Nearby, an apprentice carefully seals folded letters using warm wax impressed with the merchant's personal emblem. These documents accompany valuable cargo throughout its journey, confirming ownership, agreements, and destinations long before the goods themselves reach distant markets. A broken seal immediately raises questions, making trust one of the most valuable commodities any merchant possesses. As you leave the merchant's house, church bells announce the late afternoon. Their familiar sound drifts across tiled rooftops before fading into the gentle murmur of everyday life continuing throughout the city. Bakers prepare one final batch before evening, blacksmiths complete their last repairs, and children chase one another through narrow alleys while parents call them home before darkness arrives. You notice that the shadows have grown noticeably longer. The brilliant energy of midday slowly gives way to a softer light that transforms the appearance of every street, making timber beams glow with warm golden tones while the stone walls of churches and warehouses seem almost to absorb the fading sunlight. The city appears calmer now, though its work has not yet ended. Crossing a small square, you encounter an elderly scholar seated beneath the covered arcade of a public building. Several handwritten manuscripts rest beside him, protected beneath folded linen cloths, while a handful of curious listeners gather around as he quietly explains events from centuries past. Unlike the lively storyteller you heard earlier, this man speaks with deliberate precision, choosing each word carefully, as though preserving something fragile. He reminds his audience that history is rarely shaped by great battles alone. Kingdoms certainly rise and fall through war, but they also grow through harvests, trade, skilled craftsmanship, faithful record-keeping, and the ordinary routines repeated by millions of people whose names never appear in chronicles. His listeners nod in quiet agreement, perhaps recognizing their own lives within those simple observations. As the gathering disperses, you continue your walk with a renewed appreciation for everything you have witnessed since entering the city. Every market stall, workshop, riverboat, ledger, church, and quiet conversation has revealed another thread in the vast tapestry of medieval civilization. The castles and kings still await their turn in the story, but you now understand that the foundations of that world were built not only by rulers, but by countless ordinary hands working patiently, day after day, beneath the same changing sky. Beyond the rooftops, the distant castle once again catches the last rays of the setting sun, its towers glowing briefly before evening begins to claim the horizon. Tomorrow, those ancient walls will invite you upward, where another chapter awaits, one that will reveal not the daily life of merchants and craftsmen, but the world of lords, knights, garrisons, and the great fortresses that watched over medieval Europe. For centuries,